Katie, it's great to see you in person after several harrowing days of reporting in Ukraine. So you've spent the last week and a half traveling back and forth between Kyiv and eastern Ukraine. What struck you the most about what the mood on the ground in Ukraine is like?
I'd say two things. One is just this sheer exhaustion. I think it's easy to lose track when we're looking at this from the outside and to sort of see it in more abstract terms, to see it in terms of the lines and the arrows on the map and how many kilometers were gained or lost today. I think it's just the sheer exhaustion and the damage that this is doing to people's lives and how long this has been going on for that I think really struck me. You know, I was there for 10 days and people have been living with this for 18 months. I think people talk about moving into this attritional phase of the war on the battlefield, but I think that's very much there too in this, when we talk about this war on civilians. This is a real attritional phase where Russia is just really trying to wear down the population, break people, break the economy, destroy their will to go on. So it's really grueling what people are living through there. But I think the other point is that, yes, people are exhausted, people are fed up, people will tell you how hard it is, how terrifying it is, but there is no sense then of, and therefore we should come to terms with Russia. Not a single person said, look, I think we need to start thinking about an off-ramp. We need to think about how we get out of here. Again and again, the message was, look, it's hard, it's tough, it's a really awful situation, but we're not ready to give up. The main concern people had was that the outside world might give up on them, that Europe and the West might start to turn away.
When we were planning this trip in months and weeks up to you leaving, we weren't planning to send you to the front line or anywhere that was active strikes going on, but you kind of found them. I wanted to ask you about the missile strikes that occurred on residential areas when you were in the region and what the immediate, aftermath of that was like.
Yeah, so the real focus of the trip was to try to look at what is this like for regular people who are living through this. If you're a family, if you've got children, what is this like day to day? And the idea was to try and find a community that is living with this, but is not in what people there talk about as like the hard frontline areas. So the irony is we had settled on this small city in the Donetsk region called Pokrovsk, which, yes, Donetsk is the region that has seen the heaviest fighting. It's about 50 kilometers from the frontline area, but it's the kind of place that people thought was relatively safe. Like, yes, they're within, for instance, rocket fire range. So there is a degree of danger there, but it's not one of the communities that's being hit day in, day out. So we thought that would be a good place to sort of base ourselves as somewhere that's close to the frontline areas, but not right on frontline areas. But then on the second day of reporting, I think it was, then Pokrovsk was hit by 2 missiles.
These missiles were ostensibly, according to Russia, meant to hit a military target, but in fact, they hit residential buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I was there, I looked all around the strike area. This was a city center. This is a small city, 80,000 people lived there before the war. It's about around a third of that number now. The target that Russia seems to have been aiming for is a small hotel in the city center, which is somewhere that journalists and aid workers would often stay because, like I say, people would kind of base themselves in Pokrovsk as a relatively safe hub and then move on from there to the more frontline areas. It's important to say that, yes, there were also off-duty military would sometimes do the same. You would see soldiers in the town, but that doesn't mean it was a command post. It wasn't a military facility. This was very much a civilian hotel with a small pizza restaurant next to it that also had been shut for 5 weeks before this happened. So the missiles hit that hotel. I would say around 5 floors were caved in of the hotel, but they also destroyed the residential block right next to it. So there was a high-rise block of flats immediately next to the hotel that was incredibly badly damaged. There were a lot of casualties, and it was, this is the type of place where there was a children's playground directly outside the block of flats. So this was a residential area in the city centre. It's somewhere where people took their children out to play at night. I talked to people who were doing exactly that the night of the strike, and these are the type of places that are being targeted, that are being destroyed. And yes, Russia says it targeted a military command post, but there is no evidence whatsoever that that is what this was. This seems much more like just a brutal strike on a city centre that was intended to inflict real terror, and which was also, there was a timing element to it that made it even more cruel, which is that the first strike hit, so just after 7:00 in the evening, when a lot of people were at home in those flats, they were making their dinner, they were coming home from a long day at work. The first strike hit, the emergency services responded, people ran out to try and help people from the first strike. 37 minutes later, the second strike hit. So it seemed to have been deliberately timed to hit the rescue workers, and it killed rescue workers. One of the people killed was the deputy in charge of emergency services in the region who had rushed there to try to help. He was killed. Everybody who could had gone to the strike to start to help. They were giving people first aid, they were putting them in ambulances, they were pulling people out from under the rubble, and then the second strike hit. So the second strike, there were dozens of rescue workers injured in the second strike. So there was a real cruelty, and it's a deliberate tactic. It's something that Russia has used before, that became notorious for doing in Syria. But so
in your piece, you called it the double tap strategy. So it's very methodical.
Yeah, so it's a known technique, and it's designed to cause terror and to mean then the next missile strike. If you're a firefighter or a police person, you know that when you're responding, when you're trying to save people's lives, there could be another one coming. So it's a technique that Russia is using very cynically and very deliberately to inflict the maximum casualties and to inflict real terror on these populations.
And another dimension that you write in your piece of Putin's strategy is targeting hospitals, targeting care centers in an effort to destabilize the country's healthcare infrastructure. I mean, one doctor you spoke with said that putting a red cross on a vehicle here is putting a target on it, and that Russian forces actually target ambulances. So that's another element, I guess, of this double tap strategy. The ethos behind it is, targeting civilians, targeting the infrastructure that's trying to help those on the ground.
Yes, this was actually what I had gone to Pokrovsk a couple of days before the strike to talk to this doctor, an extraordinary British-Ukrainian doctor who's working there with the charity Smart Medical Aid. And she was flicking through the photos on her phone, showing me this ambulance was hit with an RPG, with a rocket-propelled grenade. This ambulance, you can see the shrapnel all down the side of it. She is helping to source and distribute ambulances to these frontline areas. And she says some of these groups are on their fourth or fifth ambulance from her because they get destroyed. So then they start to think about tactics. And one school of thought is then you disguise that it's an ambulance. So a lot of these ambulances are the type of ambulances people are used to seeing driving around the UK. They're fluorescent yellow and green. One of the schools of thought is you paint them dark green, paint them dark colors so that it's not obvious that it's an ambulance because it might be a target. The other school of thought is, no, the only protection we have is to show we are very clearly civilian medical workers. This is not a military vehicle, and to hope that gives you some sort of protection. But again and again, it doesn't. She was very blunt about the risks people face. She said, now when she can't get hold of somebody, the thought that goes through her mind is not maybe their phone is out of batteries. It's, have they been hit? Have they been killed? These are the kind of realities that people are dealing with there. And she said she sleeps with her clothes on, because if something happens to her and they find her under the rubble, she wants to be covered up. This is a doctor who's in this area just trying to provide life-saving first aid. These are the kind of risks that they face. And as she said, what are we supposed to do? Throw tourniquets at them? These are really heavy military munitions targeting civilians and targeting medical workers. And there are stats to back that up. A couple of weeks ago, there was a report that more than 1,000 hospitals and medical facilities have been hit since the start of the war, that the average is 2 a day. So that's not coincidence, that's not random, that's not them just being caught up in this. This is part of a deliberate ploy to really try to degrade Ukraine's healthcare system, and to target people who are trying to help people to keep living in these areas, and to provide, just really basic healthcare and first aid to people.
The most disturbing aspect of this campaign against civilians has been the targeting of the next generation, targeting children, targeting schools. You mentioned you saw a destroyed playground that parents had taken their children out that evening to. Children's hospitals, maternity hospitals, this really, quite apparent and deliberate attempt to terrorize and destroy the future, literally, of the country and the people who live there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your reporting to this end.
I think one of the most striking things that one mother said to me, I was asking about how her own children were coping. She has a 5-year-old and a 14-year-old. And she said, it's easier on the younger ones because they don't remember a time before the war. It's just a terrible reality for children and for parents that honestly you think that maybe it's better that they don't remember what they used to be able to do, that they used to go to school in real life with their friends, that they used to be able to go and hang out and play in the fountains in the city center. This mother was talking about her teenage son who before the war was really into karate, he was into swimming, he was into chess, he liked to go camping with his friends, and now she's scared for him to play outside. So he stays at home, he plays computer games. The doctor says he's starting to have some problems with his eyesight and he needs to spend less time on the screen. But what else is there for him to do? How can she keep him safe? I should say it's not like this over all of Ukraine. So if you're in Kyiv, for instance, which has extremely good air defenses, there are still air raid alerts on a fairly regular basis. But the main danger there is from the interception. So while I was there, for instance, hypersonic missiles were intercepted by the air defenses and some of the debris fell on parts of the city. So those are the types of dangers. There's always a danger that something will get through the air defenses, but it's much less of a visceral, real concrete threat there than it is in these communities in the east. But you're still, as a parent, having to make these same decisions. So if the air raid warning goes off 3 times a night, what do? Do you get your children up? Do you put them in the bathroom? Do you take them down to the shelter? How do you get up and work the next day? How do you function as a family if you're taking your children to the park? I found I always sort of had one eye on the sky, which is ridiculous because you're not going to see it coming. But there is just this sense of something could happen. And it's a real exhausting, harrowing reality for parents living there, that they want their children to have a normal, happy childhood. But they're living with this threat that at any moment the siren can go off on your phone. And then, you have to make these decisions about how do you give your children a normal life? How do you keep them safe?
Beyond its immediate cruelty, what could be the long-term effects of this strategy? What is Putin aiming for?
I spoke to a Ukrainian journalist who had been taken captive in Kherson last summer, who got to know one of his captors a little bit a man who identified himself as a captain in the FSB, the Russian security service. And he asked him, what do you want from me? What do you want from Ukraine? And he said his answer really for him summed up the ethos of this campaign, which was, he said, either you will be with us or we will kill every last one of you. I think this campaign is, we've seen Putin's military strategies fail. This terribly misguided plan that he would topple Zelensky, take control of Ukraine, and the population wouldn't resist, obviously was wrong. The idea that Russia could overpower Ukraine on the battlefield obviously was wrong. What he has left is really destroying the country. It is a real, if I can't have it, nobody can. He can't win the war, but the way that it's set up right now, particularly, in the south and the east where the heaviest fighting is taking place, the Russian troops are so well dug in. They have really well established positions that, they can't make forward progress. But it's also very difficult for Ukraine to push them out. So if we're heading into a sort of long attritional war over many years, then the key test is which country and which society can survive it, can keep going for longest. So by targeting Ukraine's civilians, by targeting Ukraine's infrastructure, by targeting the economy, Putin is trying to destroy Ukraine's will to resist. It's a terrible, brutal, cynical strategy. That's what he has left, and that's what he seems to be determined to do. And there are also cold-hearted economic calculations. I spoke to an economist in Kiev who was talking about particularly the strikes that we've seen in recent weeks on the export infrastructure, for grain, for sunflower oil, but also Ukraine exports steel and iron. These are important parts of the Ukrainian economy. He was very blunt about Russia is having more success with its economic war than it is with its military war. And these things are all connected, because if Ukraine can't export its goods, people lose jobs, the state loses taxes, and all that means that there is less money to fund the military, to fund the defense against Russia. So it's a real all fronts, all of society war on Ukraine to halt its trajectory towards Europe, towards this modern democratic future that its citizens want, and to drag it back into Putin's vision of where Ukraine's place in the world is. And so unfortunately, there will be more like this. And that wasn't even the only missile strike that week. 2 days later, there was another one on Zaporizhia. The next day, there was another one. The next day, there was one that killed a small boy. This is happening day in, day out. Often it's one people or two people or five people were killed that day. And there are fears that maybe that's not shocking enough to the outside world anymore. Maybe that's beginning to drop out of the headlines. Maybe that's beginning to not be news. But people in Ukraine are living with this reality every day, and it's cumulative. Mm-hmm. It's exhausting, and it appears to be a real long-term strategy that is going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me when you say the long-term strategy, and if Putin is digging in for 5 years, 10 years, and they already have a strategy of, will attack the economy and, impact the level of state funds that can be funneled towards the war effort. I mean, by targeting schools and the next generation, even if the children aren't directly killed, but if they end up being driven out of the country, that will have a long-term effect on the next generation of soldiers who can fight for Ukraine if they all end up fleeing.
Well, there's an immediate economic impact to that too. It is mostly women and children who are outside Ukraine. The figures that I saw were, I think, 2.8 million women of working age are currently inside Ukraine. And again, the economists have done calculations on what happens if they don't come back, how damaging that is for Ukraine's economy. Ukraine needs its citizens to be able to be working, to be contributing to the economy, and that in turn contributing to Ukraine's defense. If you create a situation where people don't feel safe, where they feel like their only option is to either leave the region and leave the jobs and leave the businesses that they had, or to leave Ukraine altogether, then that has a real cumulative long-term effect. Some of the people I spoke to in Pokrovsk were making exactly that decision. A lady who was quite badly hurt in the missile strike, she had worked to set up her own business. She ran a hair salon in the city. It was what she had always wanted to do. But now she just wanted to get away. She said, I don't see how I can have a future here. I am going to rebuild my life, but I'm going to do it away from this region. And to be honest, I'm probably going to do it outside of Ukraine because I can't go through this again. So people are having to make these very difficult decisions about how do they keep their children, their families safe, but how do they defend Ukraine? How do they not give in? Because, like I said, there was a real determination to keep resisting. One man who was sweeping up glass after the missile strike said, like, we are ready to keep fighting these stupid monsters. We are ready to keep struggling. Our concern is, will we continue to have the support from the outside? Because we can't do this on our own.
While most of your reporting for the piece centered on civilians and the civilian population, I wanted to ask you what the people on the ground you met, the sources you met, I understand some wounded soldiers who were brought in from the front line. What did they tell you about the ongoing counteroffensive and how it's going?
Yeah, I was on a medical evacuation mission with a volunteer medical battalion that was operating, again, in this eastern region, and taking guys out who they are stabilized at a position near the front, and then they're moved back. And then these volunteer medical units are among the many ambulance and medical services that are then getting them further back and getting them to specialist hospitals. So firstly, just when you're driving that road into the Donetsk region towards Bakhmut and Soledar, and where some of the heaviest fighting is taking place, you just see ambulance after ambulance after ambulance coming back. Ukraine keeps the casualty figures very closely guarded, but the sense you get from speaking to people is that this is really heavy fighting and these are heavy casualties. So the mission that I was on had picked up 6 badly wounded soldiers who'd been fighting on those front lines in the east, and I asked them about this counteroffensive and about what should people outside Ukraine understand about what is happening on the front lines, what kind of fighting this is, because I think there can so often be a tendency to focus on, in terms of headlines outside Ukraine, is it going fast enough? Or is the Western equipment making a difference? Is the Western training being put to good use? Basically, is this moving quickly enough? And when you speak to these soldiers about it, one guy said, this is not a TikTok war. This is not a beautiful war that snips up into clips on social media. This is a real, hard, dirty war. He said, what you see is blood, dirt, sweat. This is hard fought. He had been injured in a mortar strike. They're coming under oftentimes very heavy aerial bombardment. It's day in, day out, grueling, exhausting. One of the soldiers who was coming out said to me, because I asked, what is morale like? How do you keep going? How are people coping with this? And he said, if you're not scared, you're a fool. Anyone who tells you they're not scared going into these positions is either kidding themselves or kidding you. It's hard fighting. The Russian positions are pretty well dug in and they're taking serious losses. But again, every single one of them said, as soon as they're cleared, as soon as the doctors give them permission, they will go back. This was very clear cut of, this is our land. They came here. There was no option but to keep going, to keep fighting. There is absolutely no question of deciding to give Russia part of the country. That's not on the cards. And again, the message that I think every single one of the guys I spoke to on that evacuation bus wanted people outside Ukraine to understand was, we're ready to keep going. We are prepared to keep fighting and keep struggling, but we need support. We need weapons, we need ammunition. One guy said, look, we're fighting for Ukraine, yes, but we're the shield for all of Europe, because they won't stop here. It's all of our struggle, and we need support from Europe. We need support from the West. We need that to keep going. You know, still 18 months in, it's a very hard fought, very grueling conflict. And I think anyone who thinks it's not moving fast enough should sit down with those guys on that bus and tell them that they need to fight harder and they need to do more.